So I'm going to first introduce our panel members today. Chris Taylor, seated on the left, is an assistant professor and director of the Land Arts of the American West program here at Texas Tech, as well as the Studio One professor and coordinator for this semester. He attended the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and acquired his Master of Architecture there, and before that was at the University of Florida for his Bachelor of Design. Jeff Nesbitt, sitting in the middle, is an assistant professor here at the college and currently teaches Studio 3 and acculturation class for the Seoul Korea and theory and architecture at the graduate level. He attended Penn University of Pennsylvania for his master's in architecture and Texas Tech University for his MArch 1 and bachelor's in architecture. Dustin White, seated at the right, is a visiting assistant professor at Texas Tech. He's currently teaching a Design Studio 5 and acculturation class for Verona, Italy, and is a professor for the Digital Design and Fabrication program here at Texas Tech. He attended Clemson University for his Master's of Architecture, and before that was here at Texas Tech for his Bachelor's. And so, thank you, all three of you, for being here. If there are no objections, let's jump right into it.
I object.
On what grounds? Just kidding. First, we'd like to explain what the term paper architecture means for our trajectory of discussion. Paper architecture exists around drawn, planned, written, sorry, it freaked me out that changed. Drawn, planned, written, and modeled architectural works that are essentially not built and are not conceived in the built environment. Competitions, proposals, as well as design charrettes are all common mediums for producing paper architecture. An example of paper architecture would be Bruno Taut's Crystal Chain, where at the end of World War II, a group of German architects formed an association in the form of a letter chain where they would project or talk about and discuss what their ideal city or their ideal conditions for a city are, and nothing to be conceived, nothing as in terms of final drawing or finished drawings or proposals or anything like that, but just a series of sketches and a series of drawings that were sent back and forth between all of them. The Crystal Chain demonstrates one side of the discussion where there's an innate yearning for the spread of ideas and concepts without focusing on the practicality of a project. Much like the work of Lebbeus Woods, who expressed through drawings ideas that required technologies and structural systems that were not typical in the design of buildings. Works under circumstances like budgets or building codes may not have been achievable. The other side of the topic involves questioning where the value of these works or spreading of ideas lies. If it's not built, if it's so outlandish or far-fetched, where is the worth in thinking about the idea or talking about it? If it's nothing that can be tangibly built, is there value in it? Another question is, who are we designing for? Other architects and designers, and not the people who need the building? Built work is tangible. It can be directly critiqued and talked about and can directly answer the questions about a building's use and its purpose towards our built environment. Producing a building or work that does something and can be evaluated. If a building or work of architecture is out of sight, is it out of mind? And does a conversation on unbuilt works hold the same significance relative to buildings that exist in our environment? Should I repeat the question? I should. So if a building of work or architecture is out of sight, is it out of mind? And does a conversation of unbuilt works hold the same significance relative to buildings that exist in our environment? Heavy questions.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for coming.
We're really coming out the gate quickly. Explain.
I think that's going to be the whole evening, right?
Right.
Unpacking
Right.
that question. So, yes, let's go.
Why?
Did you guys prepare any introductory names?
It's all here.
Do you want to?
Go through your show.
No.
It'll be something I can defend against.
I
Go ahead. Really.
So okay, I can go through a couple of the images I have.
I mean, I have some introductory remarks just to kick things off, but they're
Okay.
It's just and it kind of responds to your question, but kind of not. It's just more an introduction.
Okay.
It's another introduction.
Please. Go ahead. I don't need to.
Can we have the website image of our friend? Yeah, there we go. Jeff's friend. I was educated at a time when there wasn't a clear path to being an architect who built buildings. When I was in school, particularly in graduate school, we idolized, and also undergrad, the people we idolized were those operating in the realm of paper architecture, appropriate for this conversation. So Michael Graves, not an idol for me per se, made his proposal for the Fargo-Moorhead Bridge in 1977 through 79. And either, as we think of this as aspiration or rebellion, it's still a work that can be taken as a model. It's a Prismacolor pencil drawing on buff paper that was framed and placed in museums. And for most, the prospect of getting ideas built was secondary to putting them forward as proposals. So people like Peter Eisenman and Aldo Rossi come to mind, as well as later people like Zaha Hadid, Coop Himmelblau, Bernard Schumi, Rem Koolhaas. Now, all of them first were operating on the fringes of the discipline of architecture, writing and drawing to develop their intentions. We can think of Zaha's early acrylic paintings that continue to play an important role in her practice, Shumi's Manhattan transcripts, Koolhaas's Delirious New York, laying out the theoretical groundwork on paper for an architecture that would be attempted years later. Frank Gehry at the time was building furniture and fish as scale models of skin assemblies. And of course, it's important to differentiate the desire to build from the act of putting ideas in motion, clearly evidenced by the state of all of these people's offices today. And my own personal pushback from this position is another story. I'll kind of leave it on as a segue, but I'll just put that. So tonight, as a form of introduction, I want to just share two things to hopefully add as fodder for our dialogue. First, the work of John Haydock, and then something from Josiah McElhaney. So John Haydock was an architect and educator of profound importance as the dean of the Cooper Union School of Architecture in New York. And I was lucky enough to interact with him briefly, and his work had a profound effect on my graduate education. So as we click through these images, let's allow the words of K. Michael Hayes, somebody I'm not particularly friendly with, in the book Sanctuaries, to provide a bit of introduction to Haydock's work. His menagerie of angels, animals, martyrs, and machines, his stylistic preference for basic geometric forms and elemental biomorphisms, buildings that seem to have hair, beaks, eyes, and legs, combines with typological variations on theaters, periscopes, funerals, traps, chapels, and labyrinths. His thematic explorations of falls from grace, itinerancy, passage, and the transformation, and above all, his belief in architecture as sanctuary. Sanctuary for art, for culture, for the enduring rituals that mark us as human, for the human spirit itself. These are all from this book, Bovisa, which was a series of ink wash drawings that Haydock made during a seminar he taught at the GSD. The rose petal one was quite extraordinary. It's in black and white here, unfortunately. And then also, you can go a little faster, then a letter from Kim Shkopik, the archivist at Cooper and a designer of all of Haydock's books. Here's a clean copy of Soundings. The matte laminate does help protect the jacket somewhat, ... This was a wild project, both to construct and to print, since I wanted the densest black possible without everything filling in. This is an opera of the trilogy. The folios are little Buddhist wheels of time, demarking chapter, project, and page numbers. I hope you enjoy reading it, and hope its arrival also heralds the arrival of other good news. I had to include that. All right, so this is John Haydick. And if we go to the last image, and he also was interested in, right, perfect. So next I want to show two short, just two 2-minute clips from an artwork entitled The Light Club of Vizcaya, a woman's picture by Josiah McElhaney from 2012. And this is a film that posits a potential past within the Villa of Vizcaya, an estate built in Miami, Florida between 1914 and 1916 for the industrialist James Deering. While this work is a film rather than something on paper, with implications about a fictional past on a future yet to materialize, I believe it may have deep potential for our discussions tonight. So the only other question that so this is again just fodder, so I think it's for us to talk about. And with the mention of Lebbeus Woods and his passing last fall, for me a big question is, with the return of the discipline focusing on buildings again in such a direct way, there's a whole conversation about why the people in the 80s were focusing away from buildings, but where have our real visionaries gone? And does a visionary futurism exist today as it has in the past in times when we haven't been building?
Well, I think I have to comment on that, and I think it's a bit problematic. I just submitted a proposal for a conference session based on just that, in terms of where have the visionaries gone, and it's entitled "Chasing the City." In the commentary, we sort of are talking about references like Kinzo Tange, obviously Peter Cook with Archigram, and are those individuals, that type of commentary on our world still exist? And I think that probably they don't, and I find it as a bit of a problem in the sense that if we're wrapped in this cyclical environment of just testing and making and testing and making, and when can we insert some really profound visions in that cycle, and it becomes much more sort of integrated, intense feedback rather than on itself in the making. If we just continually to make and make, I feel that it will get stuck in a inevitable loop in some sorts. And so I think, there's some really wonderful work that comes out of the 60s and 70s that we don't see much anymore. The last traces of that, I would say, are, maybe Zaha's paintings in the 80s was sort of the last of the hoorah of that era. And then as I was thinking about this conversation, there's people like, there are visionaries, but I'm not sure where their influence comes from. If it comes from the fabrication side of the world, or does it come from truly reinventing how our built environments are operating? And so I don't know. I think immediately that would be my reaction to the conversation and to the question.
So executing at one point instead of keeping on testing and keeping on making and iterating that way, having something built as a final or an evaluative.
Well, it's never final.
Right.
And if anybody is in here that's been my student or is my student, you know that nothing is ever final. And I mean that full-heartedly. Even when work comes up, the changes that even are made in the construction and even afterwards, it's never ending. And so this idea that we place something out in the world and it just sort of survives as it is a bit problematic to me. And that the visionary has the opportunity to question that static once it's released into the world, to it just be its thing.
But I would want to separate out the making from the application. And part of looking at the folks in the 70s that were making inflatable experiments on the city, they were making things, but they were making things that would allow us to rethink the city in new ways. And so for me, it's more when when an office like Kubilbao gets a chance to, or Zaha gets a chance to make the building, she's going to make the building, right? And wouldn't any of us want to as well, versus just make the painting? She's an architect. That's what she's driven to do. And so for me, it's a question of, when the opportunities, these shift, it's hard to resist. Hayek's an interesting character for me, given his commitment to education and to putting forward a polemic rather than, he could have built, he built a little, but it was really his dedication to education that kept him from building.
But let's not kid ourselves in terms of what is the influence in the profession. And since Hadid's up, let's talk about her. And, no one is talking about the Olympic Aquatic Center. I mean, it's a thing that came up. It's a terrible building. I've been to many of the built works of Zaha, and it's completely turned my attraction off. I tell my students that I got in a divorce with Hadid. But the conversation...
were married.
It's a hidden thing. But the reality is we're still talking about the Peaks project in Hong Kong, one of her first major projects, which isn't up there. But and so the value, and even in the teaching and the education, I'm not talking about necessarily the project in Zaragoza or the Aquatic Center, or even the project in Glasgow, the maritime terminal thing. It's really about the visionary work that was produced prior to all of the built work that we hold on to, that we as architects and theorists, that we continue our commentary on those. So those actually, in my opinion, exist longer than the buildings. The buildings go out, they're out in the world, they're poorly constructed, many issues, and the value to me and a lot of these people is actually the commentary that's unbuilt.
The paperwork.
The paper.
But don't you see that as problematic because these people have an inability to translate their own paperwork into substantial architecture, and it's not translating in their work now? And that was the argument that Levius Woods brought up to Zaha, is that he was complaining about the Aquatic Center and saying that it was garbage and that she should have consulted him on how to develop space, and that it wasn't about trying to make forms that were mimicking water. And he stated that it's not about trying to mimic water, that it's impossible because water is bound, it has no bounds, it's limitless. And to try and interpret a building like that is ridiculous in a way.
Right, and it's the wave thing.
Yeah.
The other thing about the comparison that's fascinating to me is Levi has spent time in an office, a relatively corporate office, making buildings that were relatively conventional before he stopped that and decided and pursued these drawings. And he taught at Cooper.
But he's not an architect. He has no degree in architecture, though, which is interesting.
But he didn't claim to be either, necessarily in the traditional sense of the word architect. But I have to go back to Dustin's comment and say that its inability to be sort of physically fabricated in the world isn't the point. That the point is the work is actually expressing an attitude about how we live our lives in this world and our perceptions of this world. And I'm going to have to get theoretical on you guys because I find it super important that it's not necessarily, can we build it and build it exactly like it was sort of proposed, but rather it's a attitude about architecture, the built environment, and our perceptions on that, and our traces, because we see kind of many versions of unbuilt work throughout hundreds and hundreds of years, and I think that there's a level of value that overrides necessarily our obsession about, we're architects, so we have to build. There's a whole world of poetry and dance and all these things that are sort of at the level of unbuilt, not final.
But I totally agree. And also, whether we accept the discipline of architecture as just buildings or an understanding of the knowledge about our relationship to the built environment. And so in that way, a work that Diller and Scovidio's work before they started building actually has more profound resonance than anything they've been able to live up to with their buildings to date, from my perspective. And that's to go down that road, you have to accept that the discipline is bigger than just the things that we produce that we could kick.
So you're agreeing?
Yeah.
My question.
I just threw Graves out to throw you off.
Graves really screwed me up.
I'm still running away from him too.
So my question is then, who are we designing or theorizing or talking to essentially with works such as Diller's Cophidia before they started building, or Levius Woods' later work? Is it just for other architects? Is it just for other designers or thinkers of the sort, or is it contained by that? And are we not filling the purpose for a building?
Are you asking, is unbuilt work? Are you saying is built work exclusive?
Right. Are they two different areas of discussion?
Actually, I think that's an interesting point. Did you want there's the ego that has to come into play in the conversation. And these sort of dropping down our turds in the world and claiming them as these masterpieces when they fail is a bit problematic, like Zaha's work, right? I mean, majority of her buildings, in my opinion, do not work. That's not to say that...
They don't work pragmatically, they don't live up to the aspiration.
They don't work pragmatically, they don't sort of operate as they were intended on. And I'm not
but beyond door
throwing
swings,
Hadid under the bus.
But beyond door swings, you're talking about they don't hold up as a measure of significant architecture.
Socially, as a piece to be provided for our clients, the people, our users, all these reasons why we exist. And so our egos get thrown out and, or sort of contained, and we just place these things out, and the value that we place on it is completely different than the value that the users or people who aren't architects, that's maybe a different dialogue, but I guess I'm not.
Now, I want to go back to your question because I think it's a good one, which is if we're not making buildings, how big is our public? Right. And so one of the reasons I wanted to bring Josiah into the conversation is he's an artist who's interested in architecture. He's actually, his knowledge of architectural history rivals most architects I know, including myself. And I mean, I think it's a question of what are the limits of our conversation. If an idea that is unbuilt but that provokes us can be a poem, and it could go out through the form of literature and impact a public that's much greater than a number of architecture schools around the country or a very narrowly read set of publications. And so I think actually as a discipline we've failed. Part of the weakness of architecture's relevancy in the United States is we've marginalized ourselves at each turn. We gave up construction. We don't want to do that. We don't want to get dirty. We'll let other people worry about that, and then we'll just bitch about it's not getting built to our standards. And I think giving up the both intellectual capital but also the willingness to bring people along on the conversation is a failing. And I feel better about it today than I did 25 years ago because better work is getting built and people are appreciating it, but we've got a long way to go to live up to the Italian standards of cab drivers know more about the cities they live in than people that live there. And for me, that's a question of what is the public knowledge about the discipline, and do we value collectively what architecture is, or is it just you've got a nice diamond on your neck and it's too bad the rest of you look like I mean that's the way we view our cities, right? We can get one little jewel, but otherwise we put up with a whole lot of crap, and it's unbelievable to me. But it's because we've given up the discourse, and I think whether paper architecture can bring that back. I mean, to me, it's part of a larger cultural phenomenon. It could, but I think it will take different forms than just preaching to the choir.
But coming from this in maybe an urban approach, that a lot of the visionaries in the 60s were dealing with large-scale city development strategies that were quite compelling, dramatic, intense, and they bring a level of conversation. They place a higher level of conversation about what our cities are and how they operate. Because currently, if you take out the visionary work, it's going to be the same bullshit boulevards with the streets and the trees, 5 feet from the side, all that stuff, right? And it's actually a much larger conversation about how we perceive cities. Recently, and since Levius is on the on the board here. You know, in terms of his Sarajevo project, I talked about this last night in my theory course, that his attitude about post-traumatic urbanism completely flips our attitudes about preservation and city development strategies. Without that, that conversation wouldn't even come into play. I could get into the details of it, but go read it. But I think that without the ability for us to question, it's really just a questioning strategy in these visionary works. You know, how many times have we seen the Kinzo Tange project in the Tokyo Bay? I mean, it comes over and over, and that was in, what, the late 60s, I think. And so there is value, and we should be able to learn from that. And I'm not... It's about re-questioning cities. And in that comes architecture, in my opinion. And there's attitudes about insertions of architecture into our cities to create commentary about how we operate.
I think we could say it's even bigger. It's just about the human relationship to our surroundings.
And here's another thing I'll throw out, is that we see cities in China that are getting built in, you know, a few years' time, 5 years, a city is built. I'm talking cities. And they're screwing up again, right? They're using the American suburban models, and nobody is questioning the urbanists in China are actually operating in the same methodologies that we did, and we're realizing we screwed up. So where should the value lie? In the visionary work that could be provided for these cities to rethink, restructure development.
Yeah, but for them, there's probably more into that than, because politically it's different there in China. And I think that they don't think, because they have, the government has such a stranglehold on them, and I don't want to get political, but, you know, they're not, they copy things, they take things, they don't think freely. And I think that's why, like, people, like, if we look at what was happening in the 60s, people were challenging things, they were questioning the government, they were anti-this, anti-that, and a lot of that was driving what they were doing. And so I don't think now there's people that are so much doing that anymore.
But China sets up a palette.
But in China, they can't question that. They can't challenge politically what's going on.
That's not true whatsoever, because the way that cities are structured in China is that it's run by the government, right? And so the government has the opportunity to make these changes occur. One good example is Xi'an by Plasma Studio. It's Xian. And it's one of these huge landscape urban strategies that are actually re-questioning, reformulating how we work. And so even the identity of a landscape urbanism builds on the visionary. And this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for these new attitudes and re-questioning. It would just be another China city that does the same mistakes.
I have a question, really fast. So this has gotten me thinking, you referenced work from the 60s and of course Lebbeus Woods, but how far back, or what would you see as the catalyst for a discussion like this? Because I think back to something as simple as like Corbu's rather simple sketches of his futuristic Paris, but I don't know if that's really included in this conversation. But I'm just curious, where does the starting point of this paper architecture conversation begin?
Is there a historian in the room?
Clifton.
Dr. Ellis.
I mean,
we could talk to Dr. Ellis.
And, you know, one example, speaking of Dr. Ellis, would be Loget's hut and the attitude about re-questioning how architecture is provided in the world. That's obviously, you know, much earlier, and it can go back further and further. I'm not saying that's a catalyst, but it's a difficult question. I don't think we could, maybe we'll let Dr. Ellis answer that.
Visionaries, 18th century visionaries is my second years haven't gotten to it yet. But we'll be talking about Ledoux and Boulez and the 18th century, what's termed revolutionary visionary French architects. Those are the first ones that I know of.
because they were questioning the classical orders and going back to idealistic attitudes about the world, abstractions of form, base forms, absolutely. And that's a huge effect on the paradigms that have been shifting even then.
Google Peter Greenaway's The Belly of an Architect, which is a much better book than a film, but it's about an architect putting on an exhibition of Boulet's work. The thought that jumped to my head was Dante. I mean, going even further back. I think it's the idea of the visionary doesn't always need to be in rebellion. It also can just be about what's possible. I mean, J.G. Ballard's definition of science fiction was what could happen in the next 15 minutes. It was about a future possible that's right now rather than a radical remaking of the world. And so we can look back to Leonardo's flying machines. We can go back to the caves at Lascaux as starting to reorganize our relationship to the creatures around us. To me, this is a primarily human impulse, which is another reason the humanity and the direct characters in Hayek's work to me comes back to resonate, that it's not just the things we make, but it's also what we do to each other and the relationships that we put ourselves within.
I pretty much believe it is being all the time, and I agree that since the visionaries from the 18th century. But if we go to the 1960s, 70s, we get Super Studio with Natalini, there's so many examples through all the history of architecture. The thing that I yet see that is important is the institutions that are related to this visionary architecture. And something drove me to London for a couple of years to the Architectural Association, which was exactly that. AEA has been known since its creation to be a place where visionaries kind of pop out. And since high-tech people, the archigrams, even Peter and Alison Smithson were there, to all the well-known decons that we know nowadays, Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, Bernard Schumi, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's got its moments of peak, it's got its moments that it's not really strong. Right now it's not that strong, but it's going to come back with very interesting visionaries. And check out somebody named Shin Nagashira, which is going to be one of the next ones. And maybe the last ones that Alvin Boyarsky tried to push out in the world, unfortunately he passed away, like Peter Salter. And somehow kind of like these institutions, early SCIARC as well, were institutions that were trying to develop critical thinking in their agenda. And that was kind of the most important thing on the school. And I witnessed a review of a master program, a thesis for masters, in which there were like a couple of hangers twisted on the floor, and that was the whole thing that was shown by the student. And the jury would just turn and look at ourselves like, oh, this is going to be a horrible project, or it's going to be a genius. Ended up being a genius. Ideas, philosophy, critical thinking comes together with the idea with the creation or the innovation of that architecture is in the paper. And I guess that all this vanished a little bit. In the 80s was super strong. The 90s also was kind of super strong. Early Daniel Libeskind work, early Zaha Hadid works, early Rem Koolhaas work, until they start kind of building. And what happened is that a lot of people start complaining that we were very kind of like theoretical, and we were just kind of elucubrating kind of like fantasies, and we're not building. And the same students were the ones that began kind of challenging that and start kind of like finding the way to build things. And nowadays, after that happened on the, I would say, mid-1990s, nowadays I think we're now willing to go back to that critical thinking process again, including the Architectural Association, Bartlett, and definitely places like Columbia and SCIARC.
Slow down. So the fact of having these projects and being powerful because of, we think of all these schools and all the projects and we see them as, not buildings really, or not really being able to build in the near future. So what you were saying about, for example, Zaha or all these other projects or statements or treaties of
paper projects or architectures that in a way they're safe because their inability to get built. Because what you should describe is that, you know, once they're finally start to get built, now you're able to start seeing these details of being, you know, because the way they're put together is not the best one, so you're starting to see this diminishing value of the project because of is now tangible and constructed. So what would be is there a healthy boundary between both of them? You know,
No, and I think, you know, we had a similar conversation yesterday, and I think that the building is the testing of the vision, and that the visions are going to continue to progress, but it's always the loop of the buildings trying to test utopian sort of standards, and we all know that utopian doesn't exist. It's an imaginary place, and
It's foolhardy.
Which one?
Foolhardy.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, really, I don't know about utopias yet. I mean, I don't know my opinion. It's a very complicated thing, but I have to say that it's the buildings that are testing, right? And if we're not testing any sort of visionary, it's just going to become in a bad feedback loop.
Right.
Look at all the you know, look around town, right? I mean, any house, any shopping center, they're the same duplication of bad buildings.
I think, I like your question, but I would wonder if we could turn it around and say that the thing that we see in paperwork is the ability to put yourself at risk in a way that is dangerous, if not unprofessional, in build work, right? And that allows the conversation to advance forward by different means, whether it's by narrative or pictorial or constructed means. We can take risks with questions, and that's an important thing. I mean, Javier's point about who are the institutions that promote this kind of intellectual risk to advance the discipline is a deep and powerful question, and the schools that cultivate that. I mean, Hayda cultivated that at Cooper. It was an amazing school of architecture because it was possible to take risks and ask questions that weren't getting asked in other places.
And you know, in terms of what Javier said as well, the Brits were already you know, extremely progressive at the time. You think of all the individuals, even now still, Neil Spiller, Dan Slavinsky, all of these individuals that are still testing scenarios of built environments in an extremely progressive way in their studios, in student work. And I think that's extremely influential as all of you pepper out into the world, right? It's a learning experience and gives merit and value to theory and visionary works, and to be able to think and question. If we don't, and we teach the same story over and over, it becomes a problem. We saw it from the French Academy, like Dr. Ellis was saying, in terms of a rejection against the French Academy.
Well, and also as a discipline, we just become another service sector for, you know, carrying water for people's needs. I mean, if somebody comes in and says, "Here's a picture of the villa I want, make it look like it was in Venice, you know, I'm going to throw all kinds of money at you," and that's the end of the story. Our role, you know, we just become fashion. We become decorators, three-dimensional decorators at that point, and that can be fun. There's a lot of perks with that, but it's our discipline dies.
But to comment on, and to go back to what you were saying earlier about how in the profession we kind of saw, or we're seeing that it's eroding and our role is eroding away. And so I think that's, you know, I've seen conversations where people are talking about this more and more, where they're saying like, oh crap, look, we need to get back and we need to start making again, we need to take our profession back. And so the conversations of people like Levi Swords have kind of stopped. So these futurists are, because we're trying to retake and reclaim again and then maybe start again.
For me, the big question with the loss of Hayek, Abraham, Woods, and, you know, none of these folks are getting any younger that are still remaining. Who are the new visionaries? And not that they want to be freaks outside of the market, but to go. I mean, the difference between Michael Rotundi and Tom Main, and one staying to ideas, to education, to intelligence, and one going still with broody stuff, but going down the road of of a market dynamic and getting work built. And it's great that the work's getting built, but it's a much different path. And you know, who are who's going to carry that torch?
I don't think we'll know, right? I mean, we're in it. You know, one person that I think of is Hernan Diaz Alonso, and not that I'm a fan of his work, but he's certainly questioning what buildings are. I think it's bogus. I'm not necessarily in agreement with his work that he actually produces, but lo and behold, he's certainly questioning how our environments are constructed. Hernan Diaz Alonso. There it is. Yeah. And this is, you know, a relatively young guy. He's the director at SciArc.
That one's good.
He's director.
There's his chair. He's chair of SciArc.
He's under EL.
And so obviously this is quite dramatic. So maybe this will be the next, Peter Cook in years to come. But
Google Lee Bonteque, Leebonti, Bonteque, B-O-N-T, there you go, the first one.
Do you think this loses value in a way because of the...
He's late in the game.
Because of the advancements in technology, that the advantage of these people to actually make it work better than the people?
well, that's why I have a bit of an issue with Hernan, because he's just sort of constructing because he has the ability to with Maya and the software. And I'm not sure if the sort of philosophy drives the constructions that he's sort of operating at, while someone like Levius and Peter Cook certainly were.
I have a question. Yeah.
Go.
All right. So bringing it back to paper or the medium, how would you talk about the impact of this digital era that we are in, and if paper is actually the appropriate way to talk about visionary work, or what the future of visionary work might be? And the other question that's kind of hovering in my head is, what is this kind of overconsumption of images, and how has images impacted the way that we dialogue with visionary work? If we talk about paper and the image, and how architects have explored visionary work through the image, but yet now we have all these images constantly crossing our screen in our minds, and we're fascinated by a lot of different things. So how, like, what medium actually ends up becoming a way in which communicating visionary?
But weren't they still images before?
What?
Were they not still images before? Just because they're digitized renderings doesn't mean that they're less or more of an image. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
Well, I'm more curious about the medium of paper, and so are you saying that all visionary work is now translating to digital, or what is the character or the nature of visionary work associated with the actual medium of paper?
I think it's productive to make a distinction between built and unbuilt in the terms of, especially in terms of a market dynamic, where if I'm, and so even to say, like, I mean, Jeff, you started off by talking about if it's just making and it's not thinking, we have trouble. But for me, it's a distinction. If I'm making something for a client that needs something, I need a trash can, so I'm going to make them a badass trash can, that's a different project than I'm going to make a proposition based on a question I'm bringing to the table. And so for me, that distinction between kind of uncommissioned or unbuilt in the sense of a direct thing is more productive than whether it was executed on paper or plastic.
So why is the dialogues titled paper?
I didn't
ask them.
I am. That is a question.
It's just a term that's well known, pretty much. If you didn't know it, then I'm sorry, it's not that well known. But it is thrown around as being paper architecture, which it existed on paper when that term was popularized. It's something that didn't exist as a built work or something you could stand in, right? So I would actually categorize digitized work or images as paper architecture. not images of a building, but renderings or representations of that building. I would categorize that under paper architecture, if that's fair.
And I'm going to shift this 1 second. And this is where I find the major issue is that these sort of rendering things, and I know maybe that's not necessarily what the question was, Victoria, but in terms of the sexy looking seductive curves and dramaticism in the imagery is problematic because it's purely form driven and there's no conversation about in a philosophical sense how we're viewing the world, and I don't think, in my opinion, I think it's only driven by the technology, not by another source of a more theoretical approach or a discussion.
Well, I guess maybe another way of coming around to that is I actually think that some really amazing visionary architecture work is being done in the built sense, maybe more understood as sculpture or installation work rather than actual architecture. So I guess maybe that there's another evolution that if we're just considering it as visionary, maybe only drawn or visionary only in a digital sense, maybe we're limiting ourselves to really considering where is visionary work happening. So in that way, it's not just a relationship of built and unbuilt, right? Because if there's installations, there's sculpture, exploration, then that's still something built.
That gets hazy.
And I totally agree with you. And for me, it's, again, like to look at Diller and Scofidio, their work that they did for the play, the set designs that were constructed based on Duchamp's large glass is an amazing work. And it's not a building, it's temporary, it went away after the performance, but its implications on what an architecture could be is profound. And so I would classify it in the zone of the paper or the unbuilt or the visionary, in that it didn't have an outlet to say, I'm going to be a pavilion in the town square or a city hall or what have you. But it falls out of the standard form of what buildings take. That doesn't mean, though, that it still has tremendous relevancy to the discourse of the discipline.
I agree.
All right, good night. No.
Earlier it was touched on that our education and being moved into the industry eventually. Since our education revolves so heavily around moving and not just being told and being instructed, but testing and pushing critical thinking, ideation, and exploration of concept. And when we graduate and move into the workforce, we're driven to produce. Could paper architecture be seen as a return to the exploration phase of our education? Just a process of re-educating ourselves to keep up with the world or form our opinions on what it should be? Can it be viewed as a return to the phase of learning?
I think it's a slippery slope, because once you say that in school that's what happens, and in school that's how things are generated, then it's obviously going to be restricted to paper architecture. Or it's going to be restricted to not having something built.
We can think of it that way, and definitely, I mean, I've worked in offices where I'm gasping for breath, and it's like, I got to do something, I'm going to enter a competition just because I've got to have something else to keep otherwise I'll go crazy or something bad. And so it exists in that way. I mean, for me, the bigger question is what is the ethos of our culture as a discipline? And so it's a company like Google that says, we're going to hire people that are going to be talented, amazing people that are going to want to work on things they want to work on, and we're going to give them X percentage of their time to work on their work, is the incorporation of that ideal because of the benefit of it into the corporate culture of that organization. And those examples in the field of architecture are I don't have one off the tip of my tongue, so they're not as common. Maybe you all know some, but I mean, to me, that's, for me, the impact of our ability to demonstrate the creative potentials of our work coming home to roost is going to be borne out by those practices that value that. And definitely, I mean, I was speaking slightly disparagingly a minute ago about Tom Main, we can speak in similar ways about many of these, but I mean, those people are, they're producing incredible things and they're committed to it. And so the people that work in that office, even if they're just doing door details, are working on some greater good and maybe not having to sidelight to keep their spirit alive. And so there are examples of offices that can sustain you creatively as well as financially. He's a little too caught up with himself. Hence, more pictures of him than of his work.
Well, let's talk about Maine for a moment. I saw him lecture last semester in St. Louis, and I was able to have a short conversation with him, but in his lecture, he was asked a really tough question, and I can't remember exactly the question, so I won't even try to repeat it. And essentially, he was asked, okay, well, you're working through all of these schemes and, actually quite beautiful work. I just saw the new Dallas Museum, the Perot Museum in Dallas. Wonderful work, but when he was asked about, in a sensitive way, the kind of the process of how he works and the systematic kind of conditions of how he works, he couldn't answer it. And he sort of backed up against the wall and sort of said, well, it's just, it is that. And I sort of got turned off by his response in that way, because, I find his work quite beautiful, but then when you hear him say, well, it just is what it is. Oh, come on, there's got to be something more about it.
Well, the problem with that stance, and Gary, there was a period of time where he was doing that. It's just sculpture. We don't talk about sculpture. We just make it. And it's profoundly unproductive in an educational context, because then it just falls out of the air.
Who in this room has been taught Gary? No one really teaches about Gary, because Gary is purely this form-driven thing that has, and he lets it be, you've seen the video where he's sort of just crumpling things and throwing them out. It's like, yeah, well, move this a little bit. And then he sort of sits back and asks his buddy, or the guy that works for him, and says, move that over there. And it's like, well, isn't there a larger conversation that should be happening about first, why is this occurring? And in terms of Gary, my only value that I place on Gary is CATIA, or the software.
We don't talk about his process of forming the building, we talk about his process of making the building happen.
That's right.
So
that's why I don't care about
the
Gary.
technology that he developed and used and is still developing to make those complicated geometries.
Question in the back.
Yeah, question. Taylor, you talked about visualizing on the side. Like when you're in your work first position, you're in the office, you're there all the time, you get tired of paperwork and building and testing. That's what you told about the cyclical process of testing and building and like failure, crash course. Will there be a day and age where we visualize full-time, like paper architecture and test on the side? Like there has to be a day and age where we see and learn the process of replicating, or is it will we see and build differently? Hope that's clear enough.
Talk about it in the paperless studio. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and especially, we've got incredible tools, and so the desire to be seduced by the development of the tools is strong and powerful. Columbia University, have they done away with this? Does anybody know? For a while they were pursuing the paperless studio, so the idea was, we're not going to have any paper in our school.
I think that's over.
Yeah.
It obviously failed.
It didn't work, but it was kind of founded on that. So we're going to use these tools to have a real-time feedback loop, and we're not going to need to output. And the reality is the output matters. It matters to step away, it matters to get out of the screen. And I would argue that the physicality of shaping things with your, in the end, architecture is a human art because we inhabit it with our bodies. Even when it's the best poetry and we inhabit it as a story, as a narrative, we project the experience of our bodies into that story. And so the humanity of it comes from its tactility. So, for me, I understand to me that's a utopic ambition, utopia in the kind of a dream of, there's no gravity and everything else falls into place, and it all works. Every day is Valentine's Day. But I think it's a false choice, right? It's something that we want to guard ourselves against because it can set up very sexy distractions, but they're sexy, that's what they are.
What? Say that again?
Utopia can be a sexy distraction.
I completely disagree. Completely disagree. I think that it doesn't mean that we're going to reach utopia, so we all of a sudden say, well, forget it, why strive to be utopian? This is where I have a bit of the issue, in that we are doing that. Whether you believe it or not, we are all trying to make the world utopian in the sense of perfection and what is perfect, and we're trying to get to a place where we have the perfect spatial sequence, we have the perfect city organization, we have the perfect governmental agency, we have the perfect politics. That happens daily with all of our lives. And the fact that to just dismiss that is like absurd. Like, I find it so wildly absurd.
That's good. I mean, for me, it's not about the quest that you're pursuing, but it's the.
But you're already pursuing the request. Without.
But for me, you quickly go into using the word perfect is like using the word beauty. Both are words that I think are super important and words we need to use.
And dangerous.
But for say Livius, somebody that appreciates a dystopic or a more complex and messy, fractured, cantankerous vision of the world and operates within that as their dream scenario has a very different definition of perfect than somebody like Michael Graves, right? And so the idea that the other reason I think utopia is a sexy distraction is we can kid ourselves about what the future what we want is, and then we get it and realize, well, that was kind of, maybe, it should stay behind the big red heart.
But then again, talking about utopian and paper architecture, in my naive opinion, paper architecture is utopian itself because you control what you see. And with the tools we have in this day and age, we can control it. Isn't that utopian? Wouldn't that go against?
The other thing for me that I'm challenging utopia is I think the world is a much more complicated place, and so whenever we reduce it down to a single goal or a single narrative, we run into trouble. And utopia tends to do that. It's not to say that we're not striving to make a jewel. We're not striving to make something that is the pinnacle of our vision or ambition. I'm not taking that away at any stretch, but I'm just being clear that it's a more singular desire and it's more idiosyncratic than thinking about it in terms of I'll be happy when is a bad way to go through life.
Yeah, I agree with that in that terms of the definition of utopia. I mean, clearly we only understand about. Lars Lerup told me that he has this amazing story about how we understand our cities, and he believes that we only understand about 5 to 10% of our cities. That's wild to think about. And the fact that, city planners, right, they think they get it, right? They're drawing their grids and
it's
whatever.
all figured out.
Right, and that has to be questioned. So, yes, I'm not saying I agree with utopian, the pursuit to be utopian, but the reality is we're always, even in the dystopianness, if that's a word, of Levius's work, it's still re-questioning based on what we understand as our reality. And it totally shuffles the reality that we live in. And so the quick example of this dystopian kind of idea that Levius was placing out in the Sarajevo, which I was talking about earlier, let me just explain. He basically, Sarajevo was bombed and sort of post-traumatic issues, and he was sort of claiming against two versions. One, where you wipe away what has occurred and you remove the trace and build on some other model outside of itself, or you do the other thing, where you rebuild the way it exactly was before it was in war. Now, where Livius has a problem with that is that there is no real trace of memory and the history dissolves itself. Now, can we have that conversation without that type of dystopian visionary? I don't think we can. And it completely flips the ideologies of preservation standards in a really wonderful way, I believe.
But because his projection for having these scars on the buildings elicited a conversation between the citizens who then wanted, no, rebuild it how it was before, we want to forget about the war. But because he started that conversation or projected something and said, this is my idea.
Well, actually, the story goes that it's a social issue, and that no matter what scenario you pursue after the war, either you clean the slate or rebuild as it was prior, either way, people have memories of the trauma. Whether they're personal, political, no matter the case, they have the memories embedded. We have the memory of 9/11 no matter what they do to ground zero, right? And so his attitude is about, well, let's acknowledge what has occurred and let's create it a reality socially.
Google request, YouTube, Harry Cruz, colon, the rough cut of Harry Cruz. That's the way it comes up. That was the EW. CR, yeah. And then there's the rough cut, or you can put Wrong Eye Jesus.
It's right there.
That's the top one. We can just play a little bit of it, maybe.
See, when I was a boy, Sears Roebuck catalog, great thick thing, like that, came to everybody's mailbox in the South. I mean, everybody. First thing that struck us was everybody in the Sears Roebuck catalog was perfect. Wasn't any bald heads. Everybody had all the fingers that was coming to them. Nobody had any opens and running sores on their bodies. But everybody we knew had a finger missing, or one eye put out from a staple glancing off a post. In other words, in our world, everybody was maimed and mutilated, whereas everybody in the Sears Roebuck world was perfect. And so we just started to tell stories about these people, give them names, said where they would.
So Harry's version of what Jeff was just talking about, of these images, whether your image of people, humanity is perfect, or whether it carries the mark of life and experience, and that's literally marked in our bodies. It's hard to pull it. Order?
Yes. I mean, isn't human nature itself dystopian enough that we've had enough of it? And so to create dystopia as a permanent condition, as a permanent built condition, I'm not sure I understand where we're going with that. If it's on paper, fine. I can live with that, but what are you laughing at?
I think that was to you.
I know it's rather simplified, but
No, it's a good question.
simplistic even.
You have to answer it.
It's to me.
I don't know. I just want to know where the conversation. If dystopia gets off the paper, I'm worried. Maybe we ought to just use the word possibilities rather than ideal or dystopia, utopia, dystopia. I can talk about it. I enjoy very much the intellectual conversation about representing the dystopian in us, but you know, literature does that very well.
But isn't that
reminds me of O'Connor, Flannery O'Connor. You know, if you want to read some dystopia, but building it, I don't get it.
I think I'm not going to put words in Jeff's mouth, but I'm, from my own perspective, I'm not advocating constructing dystopia. Part of my resistance to utopia is the world is more complex, and we are richer if we understand that complexity. So one of the reasons with land arts, for example, we go look at a unfinished job of reclaiming a uranium mine and the mess that it is to grapple with the consequence of that. And so it's not that we want to go build toxic waste sites, but that there's many and multiple layers and overlays in our understanding of the world, and we need to appreciate and be sensitive to that.
Yeah, but I think the whole notion of utopia actually recognizes the dystopian existence that we are doomed to live. So I don't see that utopia is an actual denial of the complexities of life. In fact, I think it's an acknowledgement of those realities and seeking for something more.
How about if we call it
That's a human spirit too.
How about if we use the word theirtopia?
Pardon?
How about theirtopia?
What kind of topia?
There. Either over there or them.
Theirtopia. Yeah, okay. I don't know. I think I've derailed you, so go on.
So it's the question. It's the question or the answer.
What's that?
It's the question or the answer.
I just think looking at messy is good, but I'm not saying we need to make messy. There's a difference.
I think there's.
What do you make from looking at messy?
I understand messy.
What do you make from looking at messy? Maybe you want
It's reality.
Yeah.
And why? How? You know, in your. I think you used the term order. Mm-hmm. Placing order is to me a bit problematic in the sense that that's a kind of a rationalized approach to the way we think, and rather than the way the world actually operates or exists. And I'm thinking in the city scale, and as I just mentioned, you know, I fully believe that we only understand 5% of our city, if that. And so there's a reality that we don't even understand, and trying to place an order that might be some particular hard structure to that reality is problematic without us even knowing the problem. So I think in terms of, you know, large systems or even microsystems of operations, that we have to first understand how they operate. And we're learning more and more, I believe. Actually, we're learning more from the micro level than we are the macro about how cities are organized and nanotechnologies, and I don't want to get too much into it. I'm sorry?
So by doing that, you're seeking the order, right, to understand how they operate. So there must be an order and system in there as to how they operate.
And there's multiple orders, right? Teddy Cruz and the work he's been doing in Tijuana and beyond on the border is looking at the way little boxes are organized north of the border and the way little boxes are organized south of the border, and it's a much different vocabulary and language of interaction. And so to value one structure or system over the other is problematic on a series of levels.
That is not Teddy Cruz.
Go for the teddy bear. And I actually have personal concerns about some of this work just because it exists, I mean, in the realm of collage making and fairly imagistic, but as a catalog of precedents, I mean, the upper right-hand image up of the house kind of tacked on a house, I mean, that's something we wouldn't see north side, right? But it's something that we may see south side, and the ability to have a different kind of, I mean, Teddy should be writing the combinatory urbanism book, not Jeff's friend.
That's not my buddy. I don't know him.
That's an amazing, or those of you going to Valparaiso next summer will understand a different form of, I mean, a very different ordering system than a classical Renaissance.
You're assuming that, right?
You know, there is one. I'm not assuming you're speaking. I'm just assuming a hegemony of architectural order.
I think we're getting off topic.
Yeah. Moderator. Direct.
Moderate.
Apologies. I thought for the good of conversation.
I've got a question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Never mind.
What are some other things you can see on paper or on the computer, but you don't want to see them built in the real world? We've talked about order and chaos and messes, but what are other things that are good on paper that don't work so well in the real world?
Hernan's work. Hernan's work? We just saw?
You don't want to see that?
Probably Levius's work. I mean, it's interesting, but
it's gorgeous.
Justin's throwing down the
Well, I think that's where the success of cataloging something paper architecture lies. You have the ability of, you know, appreciate it or hate it. But I really appreciate the people that take the, you know, they expose themselves when trying to actually build it, and they get, you know.
Oh, you want to get in this too?
No.
I want to hear Dustin continue about why he doesn't want to see Levius's work or Hernan's work in the world.
Why?
You said it, right?
Because Hernan's work is scary. These, the amoebas taking over everything. It's slightly frightening.
Let's bring his work back up.
No, but the thing is,
how old were you when you saw Aliens?
Young. I was born.
No, I know you were born. I think I had I get the scariness. I'm with you. I agree.
I wouldn't just say that I don't like it because of the way it looks. Like, I would be interested in how it would function as a thing, or building, or church, whatever you. So that project on the middle right, that's the church. Left. No, like right. Yeah, I think that's Cathedral of Vienna. Yeah. So.
But I might like to pray in there.
I want to be crazy.
Depends on what your religion is.
But it's still an image, right? Like if you had read about it first, would that have changed?
And not visual, like read about it.
Right. If he had described the spaces or described some of the relationships happening, some of the tectonics that happen, would your notion of it change?
That would be the beauty of just you making, you know, the image in your head and not have, oh, this is what it should look like. And have being disappointed whenever they try to build it, be like, oh, but that's not how the render looked, you know. That's also what happens sometimes with a sexy.
Well, that's the problem with visualization. That's a whole other story, but
right.
Can I just say something? So are we talking about renovating the cities now? Like, or are we talking about, you know, I mean, because we're talking about paper architecture, right? And so we are talking about this process and the beauty of this process, and we know, like, okay, this is poop, so let's go back. Make it again, okay, let's go back. And then at one point you build it, right? And then you don't know if it's poop or not until it's there. And, or someone's telling you, hey, yeah. So,
can we use a different adjective to
yeah, so you're talking about like even the way the city operates, but let's say that, you know what I mean, how if the city's not operating? Are you forcing that operation on the city? It's like, why aren't we just building or renovating cities now? Do you think, I mean...
in this conversation or...
No, or like, what's the strategy? Like...
What's happening?
Are you saying let's get real?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I get this a lot, and I get this because, you know, I'm very much in my this. I haven't graded your work yet. I get this conversation a lot, or like this defense back, and it's always, I got sidetracked now.
Go back.
It's about like, let's take the bullshit aside and let's talk about real things. And we get wrapped up into this complete intellectual conversation. And so I'm playing devil's advocate on myself right now, and I get this a lot. And I think that, it's like, can the intellect have the ability to have the same conversation with someone that's off the street and has no education? And sure they can. And sure there's a conversation about let's getting real in the visionary work and in the paperwork. Because it's a possibility that presents itself. Otherwise, it doesn't, and it just becomes whatever you said, poop, right? It just becomes itself.
But when it leaves the realm of possibility, that it enters a zone of fiction that it's easy to dismiss or walk away from because it doesn't have its tangibility. Can we go back to the rose petal woman? It's one of the images in that folder. Yeah. I mean, to me, this is a ink and watercolor drawing, 20 by 30, say, and it's a woman wrapped in barbed wire with rose petals. It's not in color here, but when it's in color, there's bits of red, and then the rose petals are rose colored. And this stopped me in my tracks when I saw it, and it's utterly horrifying. The question about, I'm glad this is on paper and not confronting it in real life, but in terms of the relationship of architecture as this second skin and other possible second skins, this is an arresting piece of this body of work, right? And so, to me, about this kind of question about getting real, or what is our relationship between I'm interested in the whole dialogue we've been having, not only at the scale of the city, but also at the scale of our bodies and how they interact with the world. That's a different kind of poop. You can take it away now if you want. It's a little scary.
So again, this question of tangibility, right? How far or how extreme can you go until you have to, retract, right?
Who sets the limits, or who sets the that's enough?
Well, Bernard Shumi's Manhattan Transcript was a productive piece of paper architecture because it proposed knowing architecture by throwing people out windows to understand what the building is, and that's not something we want to advocate, right?
Okay, so here's a good point. Shumi's work, that the writings with Derrida and Schumi is actually way more important than the physical follies that were built in Paris, in terms of creating a discussion and a conversation in our professions in architecture. So, it's better to read Point de Folly than go visit the follies. Because of the same conversation about, does it still have the same value and merit when it is built, versus this conversation about how we can reconstruct systems, speaking of systems.
True. Yeah, I think to me that's getting there. The other reason is that the problem is that
getting there. So you're coming.
There's more though. I think this is a classic question to break down, which is why did that happen? Manhattan transcripts and it's a whole other bigger conversation about looking at Koolhaas's love of that proposal versus Schumi. But Schumi built these little totems that are inert, that have none of the energy and the interaction that were proffered in Manhattan transcripts about the interaction of the script of the city. There was no detective mystery. It just were these big ass red turds that were fixed in static, and they lost all of that magic, even if you really wanted to like them.
But they still sort of present criticism on how we as architects are working, and the standardizations of architecture and components of architecture. It's still a commentary and criticism upon ourselves in terms of how.
But their fixity, I think, is their biggest Achilles. He built a fixed image rather than a relationship, which is a challenge for us because we build spaces, right? Playwrights enact action on stage. Choreographers, dance. So we actually have a lot to learn from both of those.
Definitely. Do we have any other questions? I think this is a good place to wrap.
I still want to hear his why.
Oh yeah, okay, go ahead.
And yeah.
I think that the question of paper architecture and built architecture for me is a question of avant-garde architecture. So I think we came to the point that not all paper is really good. So how do we know which paper architecture is really changing the profession? And another question is, for example, now in paper architecture, you need to build it in order to test it, right? And I think Lebbeus Woods falls short because there are super beautiful drawings, but never nothing got built. So how do we know it's really changing the profession, right? And then again, if you look at let's say at built architecture, right? Now, there is architecture that becomes critical at the point when it's built, but then it becomes subsumed into the mainstream, and it loses its power, right? So when we look at let's say, like Libeskind architecture and all this work from the 90s, right now it's acceptable. So people built it, and all those that we know, like star architects, they have all flew in offices, right? Libeskind, Zaha, they're all built. So it's mainstream at this point, which means it becomes no more really changing our profession. And at one point, Peter Eisenman said, architecture is only, at that point, avant-garde when the project is canonic. Like La Tourette has never been...
is canonic.
La Tourette was never absorbed by the mainstream of architecture. So it will stand forever as unique in its history and as canonic. Right?
Just real briefly, in terms of the people that you sort of brought forth, Libeskind and Eisenman and whoever else, we talked about Hadid earlier, Schumi. We know that Shumi's buildings have his current buildings, more recent work. There's no real kind of conversation in architecture theory, or good buildings for that matter. But all of them, in Libeskind as well. I mean, we can bash it all day, but their early work certainly had influenced either their profession or even created an environment in our profession to transform the built work. In terms of the micromegas had a huge impact probably obviously on his work, and which in fact changes the attitude of what we're seeing in the world. And I think that without those opportunities for them to test, and everybody, Dillon Scofidio early on, and all these sort of starchitects as we know them now, had some really powerful work in the beginning, which was quote-unquote visionary, and their careers are based on testing that exact kind of philosophy, whether it changes or not. I mean, it sort of evolves, but I think it's that ability to continue to test and never feel like the perfect building answers to their theoretical sort of premises that they bring forth.
Well, I have a comment here.
I want to answer that real quick, because I think there's more here in Christian's question. To me, the question is interesting one is the question about relevancy over time is a question of history, right? Of why is Alberti an important text about architecture today? Because we keep reading it, right? It still has relevancy, and so and whether things are on our radar because they're fashionable or on our radar because they have a deeper significance and we still are learning things from them, we haven't learned all there is to learn from them, to me is the real measure of that. I actually am excited that all these people are building today rather than just making polemic propositions. And I think there was a time that it was a modernist hangover where we assigned value to our work if it was more avant-garde it was better, right? If it was more punk rock, it was more modernist in terms of a rupture from history, it was better. And so without that, I mean, the mainstreaming that you're talking about, I think is to see it as a liability is counterproductive for us as a discipline. I mean, ultimately, having more of this work mainstream is better for all of us because IKEA, the existence of IKEA compared to Ethan Allen on the realm of home furnishings means contemporary design is more palatable across the board. This doesn't make it better furniture, better design, but it actually helps out the bigger frame. So I think we do need to, for me, I'm personally committed to letting go a bit of the avant-garde as a utopia. I think has worked against us at this point more than it does for us.
I just have a brief comment. I totally disagree with the idea that every single visionary architecture or paper architecture is going to be built in order to be tested. I totally disagree about that. I think visionary architecture, paper architecture should remain on the paper. I mean, Sant Elia is Sant Elia because of that. Boulez is Boulez because of that. Viller and Escoffidio are super interesting at the very beginning, as they are maybe not as much nowadays with some of the built things, or other kind of like people, Daniel Libeskind with Micromegas and another one. So I think we should see as that visionary paper architecture as valid work of architecture, regardless that it is not built or constructed. We gotta dislocate that old definition that in order to have architecture, we have to build something. I think whatever is drafted on this paper, I mean, whatever the sketches from Leibowitz are far more interesting architecture than a lot of things that we see built outside there.
But I'm sort of, I guess, in between here, that I think I have no problem with the testing. I think they should. But that doesn't mean that the buildings and the built work is going to be more valuable than the unbuilt. And I think it's a question of value rather than, oh, well, those visionary people shouldn't build. I think they should. Like, they should continue on doing, that's the point. It's to change how we live. But in terms of value, maybe I just wanted to put that word out there.
I mean, if someone doesn't try to build it, then that visionary word is not valuable. It's not valid at all. If no one tries to do something with it.
I think that's sort of what Christian was doing at.
I was going to say, are we thinking of the word valuable as the people that get affected by it or know about it? Like, we know about livelihood. How many people would know about livelihood or one of the buildings just by being paper? That how many people would know about it if it was built and people would actually see it or something like that. So value as trying to change the way we live by people actually being part of the thing, or by people just, quite a few people just knowing about it. So,
well, my direct answer, if that's a question, would be that we as architects can't just keep building. You have to read and read why we're building. And the value for me lies in the why, and the how is important just as much, but certainly the why and in terms of what's the kind of approach to what we're doing, rather than doing the Hernan thing where it's just this wild thing and just because he can do it. That doesn't give value to what he's working on, whether it's built or not, right? So that's what I'm saying, value is important.
Yeah, but you got to experience the architecture, right? I mean, go up to Denver and go even into the Libeskind building, and I think there's something like that on the screen that we had some kind of triangular volume. So go to the Libeskind building, walk around the museum, and tell me how many spaces inside are really interesting. You go to one museum space after the other one, and it's like an 18th century architecture. And the only thing that they actually made something really exciting is the lobby and the stair going up to the top floor. And that's it. There's a main muscle on the outside, but the space on the inside is actually unsolved. So you got to tend to. If you don't do it, it's a bunch of beautiful lines, and you don't know how to space it. Right?
I'm sorry, Christian, but
for example, if you want to change this space level, anywhere else is conservative, and make it the architecture to be powerful, you You got to send into a space where the guy is saying, wow, this is incredible. I never experienced something like this.
I totally disagree with that, Christian. Sorry. I absolutely disagree with your comment. Totally. And talking about the Denver Art Museum, I know very well that building, and I know since the very beginning what was the process, and how was all this theoretical development from Daniel Libeskind to the end. That building is done with just 2 single walls. Did you see that it's just 2 walls in the entire building? And all these twisting kind of shapes? And the process that he followed up is quite interesting. It's very, very interesting. I mean, I again repeat, all this visionary architecture, why the heck we gotta force it to be tested by being built when already the magic is there in the drawing, when already the magic is happening on the theory behind it? Why we gotta always define architecture as a built environment? Couldn't these beautiful drawings by Lewis Wood be also considered architecture? Couldn't the beautiful drawings by John Hedgehoff be considered as well architecture? Or Viollet-le-Duc, or Boulez, or Sardelia? I mean, all that is also architecture and does not need to be built. That is influencing other people later on to do new things and to kind of develop new ideas. I don't care, I'm a visionary. But being materialistic and forcing ourselves to think that an architect is gotta be a builder is gonna be a big frustration for a lot of students as well. Because not everybody is also allowed to do that. And didn't tourism on war or flesh, didn't kind of like the first books from Elizabeth Wheeler and Scofidio influence you even more than the build work that they've done? For me, yes. Flesh is a big influential book on my life. Architecture and Junction, Manhattan Transcripts is a big influence on my life, and that is framing me as well as an architect. I don't need to see the build work by Elizabeth Wheeler and Scofidio to recognize that testament.
We're losing
who is not able to read architecture. If you don't walk around, it's the same.
And that's another thing. Do we have to follow up as postmodern position and force ourselves to understand what we're doing? No. I think our commitment with society goes far beyond that.
Right. It's extremely productive, though, to have these oppositions, right? Because that's the exact question we're asking, is where the value is, and if it does have a high value in being unbuilt, then is that where it should remain, or should it translate to the other realm of being concrete, tangible, and right?
But isn't finding that line between the values, isn't that finding an order? That's trying to get an order into like a systematic order, like this is more valuable than the other. The drawings are more valuable than the actual built thing. The built thing is more valuable. That's an order, isn't it? Isn't that what we're not looking for?
I'll leave that to the panel.
I've got many orders. So I mean, for me, there's many order. I mean, I appreciate the desire, but I'm interested in letting differing orders apply to different things. And I guess my response to the orders is similar to the response to the conversation between Javier and Christian. And I think we want to be careful about thinking about testing in a one-dimensional way, that it's built or it's not built. The richness of anything to trigger a possibility to then add to the discourse about architecture. Case study houses comes to mind, right? Some of those weren't built, some of those were built, but in the end, what that whole body of work in the 1920s, well, through after the Second World War in Los Angeles, was to dematerialize the boundary between inside and outside of architecture and say this is actually a good thing, right? To move outside of that shell. That's an idea first and foremost, and it can be communicated in many ways. Having examples that we can walk into and show prospective clients or other people the benefits of that, and students and ourselves, fantastic, but it can also exist, Javier, as you're saying, as a sheer possibility.
And I think it's also a dangerous conversation actually to get into, because then you start getting into what is architecture and this big moral sort of thing, right?
Whoa.
And the reality is, just because Billy Joe stamps his drawings, he's Mr. Architect and has a building out in the world, that does not claim that that's architecture, in my opinion. And so again, I'm going to say the word value, and like, just because he or she is an architect and places a building in the world does not mean it's valuable for us as architects, people, social, So I think it's a dangerous conversation, and I guess that's why we're having it. But because it's like the maker and the theorist over back here, and I think you have to have both, because the theory is based on the reality, on criticizing what is real, and the other side is providing reality for the opportunities and capacities for those theories to be possible. If we're just running around writing papers and having sexy drawings and the world doesn't change, then who gives a shit? Forget it, I'm out of architecture in that. And so I think that in terms, maybe I'm going back to Christian's question, but it has to make an effect on the world. Otherwise, we're just sitting in a room, a bunch of architects, and talking about ourselves.
But whether that's a built work or somebody else's built work or somebody else's writing or somebody else's drawing is irrelevant. So asking the question and having both sides of the argument, there isn't a fine line that can be established, right? There isn't a halfway happy medium between, right?
Easy.
Right, that can exist as far as over theorizing something or having theory that exists for its own sake.
Well, Dustin and I had a hidden conversation a moment ago, and maybe we should maybe reveal that to the group here. And we started talking about.
You're a special dignity every night.
That's private. And we started talking about Peter Zumthor. And really interestingly, maybe he's the middle. And we were talking about Zumthor. It's a different scenario because he works at a slower pace. He's not Hadid and trying to take on 30 projects in a year or whatever crazy number she does. He works very softly. Sana might be another one, but I have never read anything from Sana. But if you read Zumthor's Thinking Architecture or Atmospheres, both have a real strong value. And this is why. Because he's talking about reality of space and materiality in the theory. And so in that conversation, he's already talking about real things through the theory, and then the work, in my opinion, that's why his work is so powerful, because it's embedded with wonderful spaces that we can actually have a conversation about, and also the space and materiality.
And human experience.
An experience.
I had a question. I think there is beauty in how architecture is executed in the built environment. Do you think designing with this construction and execution in mind, whether it's built or not, limits us or inhibits us? And some examples would be, say, Tom Kundig, Stephen Hull, and Brian McKay Lyons, how they execute their work with the materiality and the spatial qualities.
You're vernacular guys, I don't know. Their work's great.
Yeah, but I think it's a great question on the heels of putting Zumthor on the table, and this question of postulating a potential architecture, an architectural future, but coming within the language of our base, which is material, weather, human interaction, and the directness of that. And that's, to me, that's the ideal that hopefully we all strive for is, and we've been talking a lot and dissing a lot a series of people that have big reputations that operated in a paper way to the beginning, but now are fairly large and established offices, right? And your examples, as well as if there are people that took a different business model, that rather than capitalizing their fame into how big of an office can I get to then allow me to do bigger projects, which is necessary to I want those projects. And that's it's totally understandable. It's a logical path, but it's a different agenda than a level of intimacy towards how you approach the process of design and then the output. Jack Sanders of Design Build Adventure, who studied with Sam Mockbee, has said to students a lot that he's more interested in having a handful of clients for a lifetime than hundreds of clients for 5 minutes each. And that's a different philosophy as well as a business model that's affecting his practice.
I just made a comment. That's Eon.
Eon.
Eric Moss.
He says that?
Culver City.
No,
he's got like
City.
what, 80 buildings in that place.
He built Culver City from one client. A few clients.
And it's not necessarily a good thing.
Right. No, I think Jack's talking about working on one project for 40 years rather than like one single project working evolved rather than one client with many projects.
But I think in terms of like someone like Kundig, the work is driven by itself, not by necessarily some greater acknowledgement of the world, which is actually I'm perfectly fine with. I think Kundig's work is exceptional. But in the premise of kind of an idea about philosophically about space, Zumthor is much more powerful in a sense, and dramatic, I would actually say, than say Kundig's buildings. Kundig's buildings might work, but are they as dramatic, emotional, kind of emotive response? I'm not so sure. He would probably claim completely otherwise.
There's a different agenda in the works. Kundig is, it's raw, it's industrial, mechanical. It's about the material and the detail. I don't think so much. Zumthor is about the spatial experience of the place.
But I've heard, we've probably all heard a little bit of Kundig's talks. I've heard him speak a couple times, and he talks like the one where the door opens up to the water. He talks about that in a really romantic way, and I think it's solely for the kind of client experience, which is for what it is for what it is, and it's gorgeous, but it's just kind of two very different approaches. Now that we see the two side by side.
It's Albert Freig's house there on the lower left.
Are there any other questions? Good. I hope this has raised a lot of questions for you personally, not necessarily to ask now, but to take back to studio, to take back to digital media, to take back to any of your classes really, and then critically analyze what you're learning, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what you're being influenced by. So I think this was a really productive conversation. Thank you three for speaking with us, and thank everybody else for coming tonight.